I'm a law professor in criminal law at the University of British Columbia, and I grew up with the Just Say No campaign, scare tactic, drugs are bad, criminalized. So for me, it really started to change as I was driving to and from my job, hearing story after story of people who were dying from illicit drug toxicity, and it really bothered me. We obviously need to still be speaking with folks in government, call your MP and post some stuff on social media, write a letter to the editor, and there's a place for that. But I think we're in a real problem if that's all we do.
All right, that was today's guest, Ben Perrin. I'm Daniel Unmanageable, and this is Hard Knox Talks, coming at you from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Treaty Number 6 territory, and the traditional homeland of the Métis people. Let's bring in Ben. Hey, Ben, how are you?
Hi there.
How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on. It's great to join you again after meeting briefly when I was in Saskatchewan a few months ago.
Yeah, no, and I'm really glad we did meet. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. But before we jump into it, is there anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, I guess the first thing is, I just want to acknowledge, like, this is not some abstract policy issue, like, should we put a new bike lane in? Like, this is something that affects and has affected people's lives in a very profound way. And I just think it's really important to just, have a lot of compassion for folks who are listening and who have been affected by substance use disorder, by the contaminated drug crisis. And I'm really glad to see you've got Mom Stop the Harm affiliated with your show today, because I learned a lot from them, and I know they support people who are grieving, and also supporting family members of folks who are in active addiction. So just want to put a shout out for all those folks there in recovery as well, and whatever stage of their journey they're at.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's not waste any time. Let's jump in.
This is Hard Knox Talks.
So before we jump in, I'd just like to let our viewers and listeners know that today's production of Hard Knox Talks is premier sponsored by Stronger Together Canada, peer-led support groups by Mom Stop the Harm. We are going to learn a little bit more about them in a little while. But before we do, Ben, why do you care so much? What brought you to this advocacy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I didn't before. That's the kicker, and I think that's one of the main reasons why people are kind of interested in my story. I was raised in Alberta in the 80s. I grew up with the Just Say No campaigns and the scare tactics, and the drugs are bad, and so we should criminalize them and crack down on people who use them, and the supply and all that stuff. So I really grew up in that environment, and as I got older and took on some pretty senior roles in government, including as Prime Minister Stephen Harper's top criminal justice advisor, I brought those previous views, and really looking back, it was just a really toxic combination of ignorance and ideology. I didn't know and didn't bother to go look, and when you don't do that, someone else tells you what to think, and I accepted this sort of conservative war on drugs mentality, which is still continuing. And so for me, it really started to change as I was driving to and from my job. I'm a law professor in criminal law at the University of British Columbia, and about 5 years ago, hearing story after story of people who were dying from illicit drug toxicity, and it really bothered me. It bothered me, first of all, that I was part of a government that had created and amped up the modern day war on drugs. And it bothered me that I didn't seem to care enough. I was just kind of going about my day. And so, one day for me, I pulled over my vehicle, and I'd been going through my own kind of midlife crisis at the time, and was rediscovering my own faith. And I prayed a prayer. I asked God to give me a heart of compassion. And that was the start of this journey. And I started a research project and went out and interviewed and met with people, everyone I could who had anything to do with the opioid crisis. And that included people with lived experience. That included folks like Leslie McBain with Mom Stop the Harm. That included, obviously, everyone in the criminal justice and health field, Indigenous folks, the border people, you name it. And I went to overdose prevention sites, and I went to supervised consumption sites, and I went to the Crosstown Clinic in Vancouver, where the safer supply is available, in at least for a very small number of people. And I went through not just a change of mind, but it was really a change of heart. And so that's why I wrote my book, Overdose, to try to bring people who are not yet, on board with a compassionate, evidence-based drug policy to kind of go on a similar journey that I went on. And I'm still learning about these issues, but I am encouraged that we're talking about this stuff and to be on your show today, and that we're openly discussing these issues that for so long have been, clouded in shame and secrecy and condemnation and judgment. And that's when bad things thrive. And when we bring light to issues and open up discussions and conversations and have more understanding, that's when I've seen that there's a potential for change, right?
And you may have touched on it there already, but my next question, or I guess more of an observation that I made when Donna and I were at CSAM here a few weeks ago, what we're doing now is we're advocating to the public. We are bringing this conversation and the research around it and everything to the public eye, because last I checked, we live in a democracy, right? And there are so many agencies and organizations doing phenomenal work in advocating to our government. But if we live in a democracy and we can influence the way that the public thinks about the substance use related harms that are happening in our community, I think that's when we'll see the actual change. Now, and that's what our mission has been from the start, is to foster change. When we were at CSAM, we missed your talk. Sadly, we missed your talk. I wish we would have been able to sit in, but in talking to people after they attended your talk and telling them what Donna and I were doing, they said, that's what Ben was just saying that we need to do in our society, and we're doing it.
Cool.
So
cool.
But what does that mean, though? I mean, you said something to the effect of we need to stop taking research to the government and start bringing it to the people. Now, can you unpack that a little bit? Like, what were some barriers that you saw that would motivate you to say something like that?
Yeah, so I mean, we obviously need to still be speaking with folks in government, but where I see the real gap is that, and why we're not seeing the progress we want to on changes to drug laws and policies, is that most of us, if we think about, if you ask kind of the average person, hey, like the criminal code continues to like criminalize people who use drugs, and they, what should we do about that? If they were even supportive of decriminalization, they would most people, I think it's fair to say, would probably say, oh, you should probably call your MP and, post some stuff on social media, maybe write a letter to the editor, or like that kind of stuff, all directed at elected officials. And there's a place for that. And I'm not saying not to do that, but I think we're in a real problem if that's all we do. The research that I presented at the Canadian Society of Addiction Medicine, who was interested in how do we change these laws and policies that are not evidence-based and that are killing people. There's something called the Overton Window, which public policy think tanks, use to describe how major changes in issues happen over time. And what they found is that politicians actually don't lead, they follow, right? They follow. And it's not just that they follow public opinion, but they're looking at, they're experts essentially, because their job is being elected, at where is society and where is an issue moving? Is it moving towards more or less? They describe it as, freedom from government is one of the kind of levels that they assess it on. So it's not about moving more right or left. And they used an example actually of alcohol prohibition. And what they found was that, when alcohol was prohibited in the United States, it wasn't just some politician had the idea. That's what society wanted. It was a horrible idea, but that's what they wanted. And then when they had that for a few years, they saw how it backfired and how problematic it was and what a waste of time, and how people like literally did go blind for moonshine. Like that actually happened. And some people did actually die from alcohol poisoning because of the increased potency that we know comes with alcohol or any substance prohibition. And so then the window started to shift back. And in fact, it went all the way from drug prohibition all the way to not only decriminalization and legalization, but commercialization of the product, which actually brings more harms. And so one of the things we can kind of get into is different models of how do you deal with substances. But essentially, if you go all the way at one end, which is a prohibitionist model, or you go all the way to the kind of commercialization promotion model, those both have harms. And that what the most appropriate kind of approach generally that folks have argued for is that you want a regulated approach, which provides people with access to substances that are safer, and that they're not actively promoted on like Super Bowl ads and in commercials and at bus stops to kids and stuff like that, right? So so that's where the talk went. And essentially then what's kind of exciting about the realization that government follows rather than leads, and politicians follow rather than lead, is that we don't have to spend all our time trying to convince them of stuff. We can actually spend time in our communities and with people in our circles of influence, people we actually know. Not many of us actually know any politicians, or maybe we've met our MP once or MLA once, but we are in community, and we're actually going through a societal shift right now, and it's slow, but that's how things change. And look, we've been at the war on drugs and drug prohibition for over a century. Like I started out by saying, I was indoctrinated in a societal view of substance use, and so it's going to take some time to get out of that. But that means that, books like the one that I wrote for a public audience. I didn't write a policy paper for government. They already know the proposals and solutions. That's why I'm also spending time, for example, going on your show, because you guys reach people and you're talking to people and changing minds. And so that's kind of the whole idea, is we want to be spending more time doing that. And then the politicians are going to look back and go, hang on a second, whoa, we're going to lose our jobs if we don't get on board. Look, Daniel, I wish we could convince political leaders to do the right thing based on evidence, but I've been at this for, like you have, for years and decades.
It's in the votes, man.
Politicians make decisions.
It's in the votes. It's in the votes, and it's in the money.
That's it.
Right?
Yeah.
Donna looks like she has something to say.
No, I was just agreeing wholeheartedly. And I love the reference to the prohibition of alcohol. It's very early on, I recognized the sort of parallels to what we're facing now.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned something there about the harms that come along with commercialization. Maybe can you just briefly unpack that for a minute? Because like I mentioned in the question earlier, there are advocates that are seeking unfettered access, go and buy a bottle of vodka and pick up a side of fentanyl while you're at it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess to start with, I'm a strong advocate for decriminalizing people who use drugs, mm-hmm. and for providing a safer supply. And mm-hmm. the safer supply means a regulated supply of all illicit substances, you name it. Okay. Mm-hmm. We should not have, a black market, organized crime creating substances which hundreds of thousands, if not close to 1 million people in Canada are consuming at one point in time. Okay, based on some of the numbers I've heard. So this is not just a few folks. This is not just that bad part of town. This is a wide cross-section of society who at one point or another use illicit substances, and some are using them regularly, of course, and some are at various stages of recovery, and some are in active addiction.
And some people and some are people that go to raves on a weekend and they take something to have a good time. Yeah. This isn't necessarily an addiction problem anymore.
Yeah, we've got plenty of tragic situations where, one of the stories I talk about in my book, Overdose, is about it's a wedding. It's people at a wedding, and someone mm-hmm. purchases some. They think it's cocaine or ecstasy or something, and of course it's contaminated. It's contaminated with fentanyl, and within minutes, this was supposed to be this joyful event turns to multiple people, on the ground requiring emergency medical intervention, and one of them died in a wedding, and imagine being at a wedding and that's the memory of the wedding, right?
And that's in my opinion, and to me, is that an overdose or is that a poisoning?
Yeah. No, I know a lot of folks are sort of talking about this. Personally, when I hear the word overdose, I hear that someone's died because of using a substance. Mm-hmm. Some people, I've heard this. Some people think that the word overdose means someone intentionally died. I don't hear that when I hear that word. And so if that's what people are hearing, let's be clear. This is about contaminated toxic drugs. The coroner service in British Columbia, for example, where I live, tracks drug toxicity deaths, is what they're referred to as, and breaks them down by, was it a pharmaceutical drug? Okay. Was it a illicit drug? And then they ask, was it a suicide? And so those are broken out. So we can actually split out, and using the evidence that they have around, the circumstances. But yeah, look, the bottom line is you're absolutely right. I mean, this is a toxic, contaminated drug supply. And to give people a sense of it, we're talking about the difference between, grains of sand because of fentanyl's potency, which can make the difference between a lethal and a non-lethal dose. And an overdose would be having too much of the substance. You've overdosed what you thought because it's a contamination. So I don't disagree with folks who would kind of push back. Other folks say it's not an opioid crisis. It's a crisis of trauma, or it's a crisis of contaminated drugs, and it's actually a crisis of the impacts of colonization. And I agree with all of those descriptions. And so I think finding language is always a challenge with any I'll say movement, because that's what we're talking about. There's a broad movement towards what I call for as a compassionate evidence-based approach to substances.
So we kind of went down a bit of a rabbit hole there, and it was a good one. I think it was a meaningful one, but you never really finished your thought on where you're at with the safe supply. When I made reference to having it available as readily and regulated like alcohol.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Thanks for coming back to that.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about kind of the problems with substance prohibition. The far other end is not just legalization, but commercialization, and that's what we have with alcohol, for example, more so even than with tobacco products. And what the research shows is that where there is a promotion and glamorization of a substance like alcohol, you think about the bottles that were in the liquor stores, and they're meant to get your eye. The ads that are shown, people can think back to maybe the days of tobacco ads being on TV or magazines. The Marlboro Man, right, glamorizing it's about drawing people in, right? That is very unhelpful for public health and leads to greater levels of substance use disorders and greater levels of death and other harms. And so rather than go to one of these two extremes of saying it's all or nothing, that's kind of really it, right, Daniel? And it's basically like it's the all or nothing approach. Either it's all you're all in and you promote it, or it's nothing, you're promoting it. We actually want to be at a place somewhere in the middle where, and it's described as a bit of a bell curve by people who look at these kind of things, where you want to actually have a regulated approach. And what that means is that the substances themselves are regulated. They're regulated just like your milk in the fridge that you have, or your meat or your tofu, like this stuff is regulated. If there's contaminated meat products or contaminated lettuce, we know what happens. It's on the news. There's recalls. Your vehicle, if your vehicle is not safe, right? Everyone's contacted who has a 1995 whatever vehicle, and you're told to come in and get it fixed. We don't do that with illegal substances. That's the proximate cause for why people are dying. And so that's the approach that I support, and that's through the research. I think to get to your point about should it be available in a liquor store, should we go with a full legalization model? There are some folks who have argued for that, and I think if I see that, the part of that I agree with is that we want to make it easier for people who are going to use illicit substances anyway. Okay, if they're going to use, we want to make it easier for them to access that regulated, safer supply than the illicit supply. And that's where you get into questions about, who's kind of gatekeeping that? Is it just anyone who can come in and all that? And so I'm kind of interested in those conversations and like, how exactly do we come up with a regulatory model? But that's the direction that I think we should go in based on the research that I conducted for my book, Overdose.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's move on. You hear stories of people achieving abstinence from illicit substances in prison. Now, I have also heard people say, and I tend to agree with both sides of this actually, that you can't punish the trauma out of someone.
Right.
So what do you have to say about coercion within the spectrum of care in regards to mitigating substance use harms in our communities?
Yeah, I think it's really important to look at the research on this stuff. Like I said, I start from a position of like being compassionate with people and looking at what the evidence is, what works, what doesn't work. And what the research, the medical research shows on detox alone, so abstinence-based cold turkey, it's not combined with anything else. Okay, so just so we're clear, right? Just straight up don't use. That approach, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, is medically dangerous. Okay, so the British Medical Journal found, for example, that people who successfully, I'm putting this in air quotes, if people are listening to your show on podcast or driving home, people who quote unquote successfully completed a 28-day detox program were actually more likely to die from an overdose death.
And that's not the first time we've heard this on
Yeah.
on this show either.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and yet, that's what I'll say conservative politicians keep pushing. If you listen carefully, they say people need to be in treatment and recovery, and then I'm like listening, and then they usually throw the word detox in, and usually they're talking about, again, it's you just got to stop using, and the reason for that's pretty clear.
Mhm.
With opioid use disorder, tolerance rapidly decreases in within days and weeks. It's very quick, so that if you do go back, and it's considered a chronic relapsing condition, so it's a high likelihood without some pretty significant support and interventions that you're going to go back, even if you don't want to. That's the whole definition of an addiction, right? Is doing something even though you want to stop. That you're at much elevated, you're at the most sort of serious risk you could imagine, really, of using. Now, when we bring in the incarceration context, which you brought up, it's even worse for a couple of reasons. So first of all, someone who is incarcerated who has a substance use disorder, which is a significant proportion of our people in custody in Canada,
Yeah.
there still has access to substances in prison, but it's obviously much less. And we could talk a whole other show about the violence and the harms that come with that. But once you're released, you're 50 times more likely to overdose and die than someone who was not incarcerated. And, in my research, like I said, I interview folks with lived experience. I spoke with a young man who's in his mid-20s or so, and he told me that he was aware of the risk. When he was released from prison, he said, I knew I'd been told, use a lot less. And he said to me, when he was looking at what he was going to take upon release, he thought it looked like a crumb. He said, this is a waste of time. I'm not going to even feel it. And he said, just from that one, very, very diminished hit, he was on the floor. Unfortunately, someone was there to support him. But many people won't get that help because they're under conditions not to use, or they'll be threatened with be back in jail.
So what are, and maybe you know this and maybe you don't, but I'm going to throw it out there. What does the research say about aftercare? If we want to talk about the risks of overdose going up after treatment, now could those risks be further mitigated by providing a solid aftercare plan where the treatment can continue in, say, like an outpatient treatment setting, or have them otherwise supported instead of just like, have a nice day, jump back into the fire, off you go?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm a law professor, so I listen to what the medical researchers say, and I listen to what people
Of
with lived
course.
experience say,
Mhm.
and the current Canadian Medical Association journal guidelines on treatment of particularly opioid use disorder, they do not recommend detox or abstinence based on its own for the reasons we talked about. So what they do recommend is that recognizing that there are many different pathways of treatment and recovery. And look, I've talked to people who have told me that certain periods of abstinence were helpful for them, but look, we can't make policy based on one person's experience. We want to listen to that and honor that and recognize that and leave room for people to have choice in the recovery. But we can't make public policy based on, but my grandpa Joe did this. Like, I hear that all the time on social media. We have to listen to what at a population level is shown to be helpful. And so those guidelines include things like opioid agonist treatments, include things like getting support for trauma counseling. You brought up trauma. I completely agree with you. Look, you got to address the underlying root causes. Other interventions like housing first strategies, so that you don't wait for someone to stop using substances before you would provide them with housing if they were experiencing homelessness, but you provide housing first, and you provide low barrier housing. And if someone is found with this illicit substance, you don't kick them out back onto the street, right?
Yeah.
And so, on safer supply, which we mentioned briefly earlier, the research is growing. It's clear and growing that providing someone who has a substance use disorder with a safer supply allows them to stabilize their life. It reduces, obviously, the amount of illicit substances being purchased and consumed. It reduces contact with the criminal justice system. It lowers health costs. Studies out of Ontario have recently found that people are much more likely to finish their education, to get a job, to become volunteers in the community. So these are the things that we can see work when we stop criminalizing and punishing people, but instead open up opportunities for them to, first of all, stay alive through things like these public health interventions, but then begin to do that deeper healing and important work that is what I can always tell someone. I feel like I can always tell someone who's in recovery, because they're living a new life. There's a change that's happened. It's not just that before they were maybe using substances and now maybe they're not, or they're using less, but that they've gone through this transformation. They're going through a transformation,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's towards this they have this hope, and they want to share that with others. And that's
Well,
why recovery communities are so incredible.
if I can just like toot my own horn here for a moment, like
Please, yeah.
5.5 years ago, I was a welder. Well, I mean, longer than that ago, but before I started doing any of this, I didn't know how to open a Word document. So what you said there, that stands true in my life and in Donna's life as well. So let's just take a quick break here, and we're going to learn a little bit more about Stronger Together Canada, and then we'll carry on.
We've watched our children walk away. We've felt hopeless, powerless. We are moms, stop the harm. We are not hopeless. We are not powerless. Stronger Together Canada is a national network of peer-led support groups to help navigate these challenges. If you're coping with a child's substance use, reach out to www.holdinghopecanada.org. If you've lost a child to drug poisoning or overdose, www.healingheartscanada.org. We're here to help, and we are stronger together.
Okay. So, one moment here. So let's talk about demographics. Let's talk about the different demographics that these research studies are done on that you've been speaking about throughout our talk here. Who do you think is the most vulnerable when it comes to different demographics in our society, when it comes to substance use related harms?
So I guess to start out with, I mean, we know that substance use and substance use related harms and deaths do cross all cross sections of society. So I think start with that, from the very young to the very old. Men, women, gender diverse, gender non-conforming folks, white, indigenous, black, people of color, poor, rich, like it really does. So I think it's important just to begin with that. But then, your question is right, is who does it disproportionately impact? We've got to think about that. Who are the most vulnerable and marginalized? And what the data and the research on this show is that there's really three groups in particular that are disproportionately impacted. And before I get into demographics, overall it skews towards men who are overdosing and dying. But except for, and of course there's, thousands of women who've died, but we're talking percentages and all that, right? So we've still got a majority of more than a majority of men. In terms of ages, we're seeing people who have died as young as 12 years old from overdose-related deaths in Canada. But the kind of average is quite a curve and a large clump of people in the sort of 25 kind of mid-20s to 40 40 range. I'm not sure how old you're, Dan. I'm 43.
I'm 42.
I'm 42. Yeah. So our age and gender is right, sort of smack dab right in the middle of the kind of the median, victim of the drug war. But again, it goes back and forth. So that's at a high level. But when we talk about groups that are disproportionately impacted, I think I'd start by talking about the impact on Indigenous peoples who have been significantly overrepresented in both overdoses and overdose deaths, fatal overdoses. And when we look at further at Indigenous peoples and the impact on them, that gender disparity that I mentioned ago between men and women, it actually does not exist in that way with Indigenous peoples. And so Indigenous women are significantly overrepresented in overdose-related deaths. And, I would love to spend tons of time on this, but people are hopefully at least a little bit, or maybe even a lot, aware of why that happens. It's very clear the intergenerational impacts of residential schools and the Indigenous child welfare crisis and the over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples and the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands and resources has directly thread through the intergenerational trauma to today. And it's not even just, these were things that happened in the past. These things are ongoing, of course. And the research shows that they're transmitted even genetically. And so the field of epigenetics is all about how trauma impacts people at the genetic level, and it actually passes down. And, it's at the point in terms of the research where we even have like Canada research chairs at universities like UBC on epigenetics. So it's all about how trauma can impact us at that cellular level even. So that's the first group of folks I'd mention. The other is obviously people who are poor, who are experiencing homelessness or precariously housed, who are underemployed or unemployed, or at a heightened risk. And the third group would be, and there's overlap and intersections between all these groups, of course, is people who have spent time in custody. In Alberta, it was disclosed by the former premier at one point that half of everyone who had overdosed and died in the province of Alberta during a 2-year period had been in provincial custody at one point. That's a pretty massive point to make, and it speaks to what we talked about earlier, where I look at if someone with a substance use disorder, opioid use disorder in particular, is what I'm familiar with from my research, is incarcerated. That's equivalent to giving them a death sentence for many folks. And in BC, we've seen similar statistics. You're at the highest risk within you're at the highest risk within weeks and months after release, but the effect carries on for years. And so the why that is as well, prison is incredibly traumatic for most people. The trauma and violence in our provincial and federal institutions are massive. And so that like layer upon layer upon layer of disadvantage, trauma, marginalization, and you've got a substance like opioids, which are actually pain relievers, like that becomes a self-medication. So those are the groups broadly that are disproportionately impacted. But again, I've heard from families personally who are, I'll just say it, professionals, white, upper middle class, people who work in Health Canada even once, tragically, and they, go to wake up their daughter or son for breakfast one morning and they find them, they're deceased. That's their last moment they've seen their child. So, it's important to recognize the vulnerabilities there. And I also think this helps me understand why more isn't being done, because the groups of people I just mentioned are treated like second class citizens or untouchables. They're not given the time of day by government. They're treated with fear and racism, hatred, and I see that hard edge that society has towards those groups I just mentioned. I actually see it starting to even get worse in some ways.
Yeah. So what can we do? We spoke earlier about bringing the research to the people, correct? And typically when we ask our guests, what do we do? Oftentimes we're met with, well, write a letter to your MLA or post something on social media or the things. And I'm not discrediting that. Yeah. But in knowing what you know, what can we do?
I think first of all, for me, it started with we've got to examine ourselves. So everyone who's listening to this is at a different place. So I don't know where folks are at, but if people have some experience either themselves or with a family member who has struggled with substances, the research shows they're much more likely to support compassionate, evidence-based approaches. So you've already got a bit of a head start there. If you don't, then I would say listen to folks with lived experience, right? Listen to what they have to say. There's a whole bunch of different podcasts in addition to yours and other ways you can actually hear from folks with lived experience about their journey and their how they feel we should address the issue. And I in my book, what I try to do is really two things to help people to come alongside this new approach to substances is compassion and understanding. And that's to tell the stories, let people's stories speak. That is so powerful. That is evidence in a court. If you were to have a trial, what do? We call people and we put them on the stand and we say, tell us your story, basically, right?
Yeah.
That's a form of evidence. If it were a trial, that's a form of evidence that matters. Your story matters. It's meaningful. It's significant. It's important. And everyone's story is different. And so that's why I'm so grateful for folks who do share their story and did share their stories with me for other folks to read in my book. And then to say, oh, but that's not just this one person. That there's actually research that shows that this is a thing. Like what they've experienced is not just a one-off, or that this is broadly what we need to do. And so I think greater levels of education and understanding around why people use substances, what the impact of trauma is on folks, basic information, like that, this is a toxic drug crisis. It's poisoning, that it's caused by, primarily a substance that is a pain relief medicine. It's not a party drug, that this is a public health issue, not a criminal law one. I just went through kind of 3 kind of bullet points that I always just go back to again and again. And that's part of shifting our views of society, shifting away from a criminal justice lens to compassion and evidence. And look, there are folks who, like I was before, think, well, lock them all up, let's throw away the key. And my approach to them is to say, hey, we've tried that and it hasn't worked. And by the way, if you're a taxpayer, you're paying for it. Like, you're paying to incarcerate people you're just making it more likely that they're going to overdose and die. And if you have any kind of heart within you, that should bother you. It should disturb you. And if it doesn't, like, there's not a lot we can do for folks who are at that point where they're so hard edged. And I read it on social media, where people are willing to live in a society where we know what can be done. Right? We know that there's a different way to approach this, providing people with a safer supply, decriminalizing them, providing them support for rapid access to evidence-based treatment and recovery. And that's what works. And I want to be one of the folks who's saying we need to do those things and speaking out on that. Mm-hmm. And look, at the end of the day, we want to be able to, as a society, look back and say, there were people who were speaking up. I talked about residential schools a minute ago. One of the kind of remarkable stories in the Indian residential school system history is in the 1920s. There was an official in what was called the Department of Indian Affairs at the time. He was the doctor who was in charge of investigating residential schools. And he wrote a report and published it. Imagine the guts it would take to do this as a government official. He published it, and it was called A National Crime. And he chronicled how residential schools were actually treating Indigenous kids and how they were dying and in massive numbers. And he called it out. And now when people look back, I've heard Indigenous people point back and go, at least there was someone who was willing to stand against this. And that's where we need to be able to be. And I hope it's more than that, but you're either on one side or the other on these issues. This is a life or death issue. This is the leading cause of unnatural deaths in the province I live. We've had lower life expectancies in the province. We need to care about this. And if we don't, we need to look at our own hearts. And so I would encourage people, whatever stage you're at, if you're not educated yet on this stuff, like I wasn't at all, and I'm still learning, make it a point to learn. And then within your own circles of influence, begin to share what you've learned and be open-minded, be willing to work with others within your own community. That's really what's going to change this over time. Yeah. Don't worry. Don't stop calling your MLA or MPP or
no, absolutely.
But don't make that the only thing you do. Don't think, well, I'm done my job because I clicked like that is not how social change works.
I had coffee with our MLA, our NDP MLA last week. I went down to her office and I had a great conversation with her.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, they need to hear from you, because part of them perceiving that the societal window on an issue has shifted is who they hear from. And so, yeah, do that, but don't only do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool, man. Well, we're over time. And I think we've touched on everything that we were going to. Donna, is there anything you'd like to add in?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Ben, is there anything you'd like to say before we let you go?
Yeah, I just really thank you for letting me come on today. And I'm very grateful for the work that you folks are doing as well. And it's so important to be having these conversations. And I hope that more people do as a result. So thanks.
Awesome. Okay. Well, and thank you for the work that you're doing and you're continuing to do. And I definitely would like to have you back again in the future. But for now, take care. We will see you next time. All right. If you're getting something out of what we are doing here, you can find all our audios on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts, or live and interactive right here on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch TV. Thank you for watching, and take care, my friends.
Say, this is Hard Knocks Talks.